Hi, everyone, and welcome to Night School. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Christina. Welcome back.
Hi. And we are part of the nightlife team at Cal Academy in San Francisco. For those of you that are new, Nightlife is our weekly Thursday night events where we mix science with some creatures, cocktails, live music, and more. Night School is our at-home edition, minus the cocktails, unless you bring them yourselves, like our friend Deanna in the comments. It is our Night School 1-year anniversary. Last year on April 2nd, well, we're one day off, but last year on April 2nd, we produced our first ever Nightlife and Friends live stream, giving a special shout out to our other team member, Richie, who's always behind the scenes and doing our lovely waiting room music, among other things. But 41 events later, here we are.
And it's also special that it's a 1-year anniversary because our very first Night School edition was hosted by the Academy's Curator of Botany, Nathalie Nagalingum, who I think we had guests from the Conservatory of Flowers and the Botanical Garden. And she is back to do a very special guest host for a Night School that was her brainchild. Adventures of Botany. So we're going to bring her to the stream. Hey, Natalie.
Hello. Happy first birthday.
Thanks.
So today, Lynn and Christina contacted me a little while ago and told me that they would like me to host another Nightlife. And so I started thinking about, what I would like to have as a Nightlife. And I was thinking about how the world has become a bit smaller during the pandemic, and I thought I'm going to invite 3 accomplished women to talk about their adventures around the world. And they're going to take us to all these different countries and continents and habitats today and tell us about their search for plants for their research. But I wanted to ask you, Lynn and Christina, about your own botanical adventures. And so if you can tell us all about your favourite houseplants.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
I'll go first. So I brought my favorite houseplant. Do you know what this is, Natalie?
I can't. You're in the window and you're obscured, so I can't see.
Okay.
But
okay. It's a Christmas cactus. And I like it the most because it has incredible flowers when it blooms, and also it's something that my dad propagated for me. The one that he has at home is like gigantic. He's incredible at it. But he made this cutting for me, so I love it.
Lovely.
Nice.
Thank you. And Lynn, tell us about your favorite houseplant.
Mine is not visible, but I'm staring at it from across the room. It is my Monstera plant, and I feel like it's my favorite just because I raised this little baby for the last 2 years. It was my first plant that I got when I moved into this place, and I've just seen it grow. So it's kind of going a little crazy right now and reaching for all ends, but I think that's how we all kind of feel sometimes. So it's my favorite.
That's great. Thank you, Lynn. Everybody at home, please tell us about your favorite houseplant, your own botany adventure, and why it's your favorite. And I'll read some out during tonight's live stream. And we are definitely live, so please say hello and tell us about your plants.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Natalie's gonna be doing a Q&A after every presentation. So please drop your questions that you have for each guest in the chat too. So should we let you get started, Nathalie?
Yeah, so thank you. I'm going to bring on Dr. Tanisha Williams as our first guest. Thank you, Lynn and Christina.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Tanisha.
Hi, Nathalie. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for just accepting this the random email that we sent you and saying, yes, I'll do it. And so Tanisha is a postdoctoral fellow in botany at Botanical University. And where are you calling from?
I am in Pennsylvania, but I'm in my home right now. I'm not in the lab. So I'm in my home, which is why I have all these nice pictures of plants in the background.
And can you tell us about your favorite houseplant?
Yes, and I have mine right here as well. I have this huge pothos with all of these trailing vines right here. So this is one of my favorites, and I actually got this right before the pandemic started, and it's my favorite because it is just a long-lasting plant and it can survive under any type of conditions. And my house doesn't get a lot of sunlight, so it's been one of the plants that has been thriving in my low-light home.
That's wonderful. Well, congratulations for growing it.
Thank you.
All right, well, I will let you start your presentation and I'll be back to talk about, to give you the Q&A from our audience.
That sounds great. So today I'm going to talk about our adventures in botany, but I'm going to give you guys the South African edition. So this is a picture of Cape Town. We can see here Table Mountain, that flat mountain in the background, Lion's Head, and then also the stadium. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here, but this is the stadium that the World Cup was held in South Africa. And so when you think about South Africa, or if you've been to South Africa, what are some of the things that come to mind? Often people think about the Big Five and all of the wonderful animals that you can see in South Africa. Here I am with penguins on the beach, which is an amazing experience as well. And I've seen all of these animals on this page. And during the pandemic, we got a lot of free concerts, and Versus was a big concert where artists of the same genre would come together and just give this really nice conference. But now I want to do a Versus of South African animals. So I wish I had an announcer's voice to say, like, in our left corner, we have this puff adder snake, this venomous snake. And then in our right corner, we have the Cape Gray mongoose. And I would love to hear in the chat, if you guys can write it down in the chat, who do you think is going to win this epic battle between this venomous snake and this mongoose, which have the same, as I'm putting here, the same style of attack, this ambush style of attack. So I'm going to play a little snippet for you. So as we can see here, the mongoose is circling around this puff adder snake. The puff adder strikes. The mongoose is made sure that he was safe away. The mongoose is continuing. That puff adder is in its attack position. There is a second mongoose in the rocks towards the left. And then for the throat, the mongoose gets that puff adder. So the Cape Gray mongoose won that battle, and this is an epic biological interaction that not many have seen. I showed this tape to many of our collaborators. I was actually with my lab mate and an undergraduate student. We were hiking in that park and saw this as on our way out. I'm definitely afraid of snakes, so I wanted to drive away, but they forced me to stop, and I'm glad, because that's just a phenomenal interaction that we saw. But then you may think about hiking when you think about South Africa and the beautiful landscapes. You'll probably think about the people. And most people know Madiba, as he's known in the country, but Nelson Mandela, most people, the first thing they think about is apartheid, Nelson Mandela, the struggle for freedom. South Africa has 11 official languages. You may think about the beaches, about the wine. I saw there were some people that were coming into the chat from California, from the wineland. So you may know very well how good South African wine is, the resources, as well as South Africa is this out of Africa hypothesis of where the human species originated. So the cradle of humankind is found in Africa, in South Africa. But did you know that if you just look down on the ground in South Africa, you will see this beautiful, beautiful diversity of plants. South Africa is overflowing with the biodiversity of plants. And here are some of my favorites. Here are the names, the scientific names of these plants. Pelargoniums, I have a couple pelargoniums here, which I'm gonna talk more about later on. Protea. The protea, I feel like a lot of people know protea because of that distinctive floral structure. It's a large, very large grouping of flowers. And it's also the national flower of South Africa. But we have sage on here, aloes. There's many different aloes throughout, cycads that Nathalie will talk about. Just a bunch of different, just wonderful, beautiful plants. And this is not even the tip of the iceberg. So South Africa, just in general, not only plant-wise, is the third most biologically diverse country in the world. And we're seeing that 10% of all the known birds, fish, and plants are found throughout South Africa. As far as plant diversity, South Africa has the 5th highest number of plants in the world. And it is anyone that loves nature, that loves plant, a botanist. It is a botanist's dream. So here I'm showing on the left hand that picture is the spring bloom. So springtime in South Africa is happening between the months of September through November. And you see this kind of blooming of these flowers. And it's normally in these really arid portions of South Africa where normally throughout most of the year, it's very dry, very kind of like gray and not a lot of green going on until the rains hit and you have that September through November, and it's just beautiful. So I'm showing the Cape daisies right there, or Cape marigolds. In the middle there, that's me excited to find a pelargonium I was searching for. And so what gives rise to all of this plant diversity in South Africa really is the environmental heterogeneity. And that's just saying that South Africa has several different rainfall regimes across the country. It's a huge country, different soil types, and all of this is giving rise to these high levels of endemism. And endemism is the plants that are found nowhere else. So nowhere else in the world, these plants are only found in South Africa. So to learn more from South African botanists and scientists, I highly, highly recommend that you follow these 4 South African botanists / scientists on their Instagram page. So Mashudu, it's from South African National Botanical Biodiversity Institute, and he helped me with my common gardens I'll talk about. Professor Makunga, she's part of Black Botanist Week. She's at Stellenbosch University. Rupert is part of Black Botanist Week as well, is a part of, he is the conservation manager of the Botanical Society of South Africa. And Hannah Peterson is a research assistant at the University of Cape Town. So definitely screenshot this and follow them. So why is South Africa so hot? And I'm not talking about temperature, I'm talking about plant biodiversity. So let's get into these hot spots. So a biodiversity hotspot is what I have pictured here by Myers et al. And we can see that the Cape Floristic region right here is a biodiversity hotspot. And a hotspot is characterized as a place having many unique species, many endemic species, as well as many threats such as climate change and industry and destruction of habitat to these really unique places. So the Cape Floristic region is the smallest of the 6 floral kingdom. It's about the size of Pennsylvania. I think that's pretty small. And within this small landmass, it has 10% of the world's plant. And of those 10%, 6,000 of those are endemic to the Cape Floristic region, found nowhere else. 7% of reptiles, birds, and mammals, 50% of the coastal marine system. So wherever you go within South Africa, you're going to find explosive biodiversity. And it's also a World Heritage Site because of this biodiversity. So I went around throughout South Africa looking at many plants, but my focal genus was Pelargonium. And for a really good trivia fact, Pelargonium that you can buy at the grocery store and the hardware store or the common geranium that you can buy is actually a Pelargonium variety from South Africa. So that's a good trivia fact. Pelargoniums have a lot of different uses and are known for for their flowers, but also they're used in the cooking and medical industry. So here I'm showing Pelargonium graveolens. All that geranium oil is actually coming from pelargoniums. 90% of the things called rose scented are coming from Pelargonium graveolens. Pelargonium cuculatum here is used in cooking. If you boil the leaves in traditional medicine, it's used for stomach ailments. Pelargonium cyoides in traditional medicines, if you're boiling the tubers and the leaves, are used for respiratory tract infections. That Pelargonium cough syrup right there, that you can buy that on Amazon right now. And Pelargonium tomatosum has a peppermint essential oil in the leaves, and that's used in cooking as well. So it's a highly diverse genus of perennials, shrubs, and geophytes. So geophytes, think of underground tubers like your onions. It's known for its leaf shape and floral diversity, definitely for the floral diversity. People love pelargoniums, people love geraniums. And there are about 280 species and counting. We're still finding new species of pelargoniums throughout, mainly throughout northern South Africa. Of that 280, 160 are found in that Cape Floristic region. And of those 160, 89% are endemic to the region. So where did I meet all of these cool pelargonium plants that I'm talking up right now? So here is just a little bit of the field work that I've done. So I have been up near Johannesburg and Bloemfontein, but I want to just take you along the coast. And this is many, many months / years of driving, hiking, backpacking, and collecting plants, which equals many, many years of falling deeply in love with South Africa. So here is I feel like this is the glamorous life of field botany and being a field ecologist, which is hunting, going around, hiking around, trying to find these plants. What's not shown is all of the background, all of the long days of driving, long hiking, all of the dirty clothes and not showering and all of those things, trying to find these plants. And I told you about snakes. I have found so many snakes throughout South Africa because I'm so afraid of snakes. But I've got to see a lot of biodiversity. But here I am watering a common garden. And after all of this work that I did to put these plants in the ground, this is what they initially look like. And over here, this photo at the bottom left is what they looked like the last time I went to go visit them. And these are just some of the pictures of me finding these plants, collecting these plants, some of the scenery and people that I've met along the way, the housing that I got to go to, some of the national parks, as well as, it's so funny, there's this picture here, you can't quite see the goats crossing, but I had to wait. I should calculate how much time I spent waiting on goats to cross the roads, elephants to cross by, and baboons to move out of sights. So I did work in the Northern Cape here. Here I'm showing some of the scenery and me working, looking for several plants, but one of my favorite pelargoniums, which I'm picturing here, is Pelargonium praemorsum. And I did all of this in this tiny rinky-dink car because that's what I could afford. But that car did me well. And I also went to the Eastern Cape. Here I'm showing some aloes, but here we have Pelargonium acamaloides, Pelargonium capitatum here, and some sites right on the coast. These pelargoniums are found as well, and just beautiful, beautiful sites when searching for these plants. So it's a lot of fun being a botanist. As well as in the Western Cape, this is where Cape Town is, hiking around, going around, trying to find as many plants as I can. So Pelargonium cuculatum is up above. We have alcamaloides. Again, this is cuculatum at a site that was, it was super kind of snowy, icy that day, and we can see all of this frost on the leaves. But I did all of this and visited all these sites, all to answer this question: how will species respond and can they adapt to climate change? And I did that using herbarium records, and in the middle using garden experiments, and then also using species distribution modeling to forecast what Pelargonium's distribution will look like in the future. And I do this because, as we see here, breaking news, the Cape Floristic region is ranked as the world's second worst area for plant extinction. So we've seen 40 plant extinctions since 1990, and counting. You guys can ask me about what's number one, or I would love to hear your opinion on what's the world's first area for worst plant extinction. So write those in the comments. So how might plants respond to climate change? I think about it in kind of three different areas: phenotypic plasticity, adaptation, and migration. So plasticity, as you think being plastic, being able to change your morphology or behavior. Adaptation, once you change your morphology or behavior, is that adaptive? Are you able to pass those genes on? And migration, do you not change at all and you just track the favorable climate? So in the studies that I've done, I found that pelargoniums have historically changed. They are responding to climate change. So throughout the Cape Floristic region, the temperatures have risen by 3 degrees over the past century, and pelargoniums are flowering about 12 days earlier in response to that temperature increase. For my garden experiment, I found that pelargoniums are extremely plastic. They have a lot of morphological variation that is dependent upon which environment they're grown in. So this could make them a good candidate in order to respond to climate change impacts, yet they do not like hot and dry climates. And what I haven't told you about the climate projections, the Cape Floristic region is projected to be very hot and very, very dry. So that's not good for pelargoniums. Also, using those species distribution modeling, which I'm showing here, pelargoniums are definitely responding to when they get water, when they get their precipitation, and habitats are projected to be greatly, greatly reduced. So I did projections currently what they will look like in 2050 and 2070. So this map here is showing the red is a high probability that a species is going to be found there, all the way to the blue, very low probability you're not going to see the species here. So this is Pelargonium praemorsum, one of the plants I collected in the northern Cape. So this is currently, that's 2050, that's 2070 projection. So this is really, the habitat is contracting and marching right up, but this marching north up to the Namibian desert, and that's really hot and dry, and pelargoniums don't like it really hot and dry. I also identified 89 species that would have their habitat drastically reduced by 2070, and praemorsum is one of the critically endangered species because this drastic habitat reduction is going to happen by 2050, and that's not that far away. So is there a silver lining to this? I think so. Although pelargoniums are going to see drastic impacts to climate change, I feel like pelargonium, the species that we're seeing, have the ecological and evolutionary tools to respond and hopefully mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And we're seeing that in their ability to respond to this temperature climate change, this temperature increase right here in the herbarium records, as well as all of this morphological variation we're seeing in the Common Garden study that I did. So with that, I want to thank both of my PhD advisors, Dr. Kent Hallsinger and Dr. Schlichting from the University of Connecticut. I have a host of American and also South African friends and collaborators that helped, and funding sources that helped in this work. I also want to thank where I am now. I'm working with Dr. Chris Martin, and I've moved out of South Africa, although I'm still doing work there, and moved into Pennsylvania and Australia. So I want to thank these people as well. And then lastly, I'm just going to throw a little plug in for Black Botanist Week. I am one of the committee members from Black Botanist Week, and I highly encourage you guys to visit our website, connect with us on Twitter, and we have really exciting events coming this summer. And if you want to hear from us once a month, you can head over to the Holden Forests and Gardens. We have a series there called Growing Black Roots, the Black Botanical Legacy. And with that, I just want to thank all of you guys for coming, and I'm excited to hear more about your favorite plants, what your favorite places in South Africa, or what you know about South Africa. And please send me an email or follow me on these platforms and connect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. That was amazing. Having been to South Africa a few years ago, I absolutely loved it. And so I totally understand how you fell in love with it. I definitely fell with it too.
I talk about it all the time. I'm like, everyone must go.
It's true. Yes, I'm the same. I came home and I was like to my husband, we need to go there. I want to go on sabbatical and work there. And so I totally love it. And I loved your talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We had people answering your question about the top places for plant extinctions. Here are some of the guesses. We had Hawaii, we had the Amazon, we had Australia, North America, Madagascar. Do you want to give us the big reveal?
Wow. Whoever said Hawaii, it's Hawaii. Yes, you got it. It is definitely Hawaii. Hawaii, so South Africa was 40. Hawaii was at 60 or 65 species extinct since 1990.
That's a huge
but all the other guesses are really great as well. Like those are great guesses. We're seeing across the globe impacts of extinction. So, but yeah, Hawaii.
That's great. Well, congratulations to whoever chose Hawaii.
Yes.
And so we had some other questions. Some people wanted to know about the cacti they see in your photos. Are cacti invasives and problems in those areas that you worked in?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, because we, I don't recall of the cacti being invasive there. South Africa really has a big problem with acacia trees there. That's one of their huge headaches. As far as like, because I talk about this knee-high forests, I just did a little blurb about that, but a lot of South Africa has trees and many different shrubs that are really tall, like proteus are taller than I am, some of them, but a lot of the diversity, you have to like look from the knees down, and acacia trees are definitely the problem, not cactus or cacti. Because of this thing called bush encroachment. So they're really tall, they grow in really dense formations, and they really shade out and exclude other plants. But great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so we had like a general question, what inspired you to get into botany?
That's a good question.
There's another part to that, but I want to hear the first part.
Yeah. So when I started to think about this, it's really my great-grandmother. So I was raised by my great-grandmother, and she had this wonderful collection of plants, but in particular, she loved African violets. We had African violets all throughout our house. And I just remember like helping her water these plants. And I really didn't say like I want to be a botanist. I didn't even know what that was growing up, but I just happened upon love being outside hiking, and yeah, I think it definitely stemmed from her and her green thumb.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I was definitely the same. I didn't know you could be a botanist growing up.
I did not know that. Yeah.
So I love that we're both botanists now.
Yeah.
And so the other part of that question was, how does the team decide what plants to study? So how did you decide to study Pelargonium?
That's a great question. So it was nothing that had to do with me. It was actually the lab that I came into. So for my PhD, I applied to be in Kent and Carl's lab, and they were working in South Africa. And we actually have two legs to our lab. There's a whole group of us out of Yukon that works in South Africa. Some of us working on pelargoniums, others working on proteas. And I will say, as behind me, I have a protea print. I have more protea stuff in my house than I do pelargonium. But the questions I wanted to answer were easily answered on the pelargonium side. And so that's how I got into pelargoniums. And I'm happy. Like they're a wonderful genus to study. A great question.
They're definitely beautiful.
Yes.
I remember we went to the Botanic Garden a little while ago. My friend Rebecca, her daughter, bought a little pelargonium and said, and they asked me more about it, and I was like, I don't know where it even comes from. So there you go. You've answered their question.
South Africa.
And then one last question is considering sort of plant adaptations and how plants change in response to climate. How does a plant become a new species in response to climate change? Are we going to see that?
That's a good question. So I would like to say we're kind of getting at that question on Australia right now, not South Africa, but this will apply across the board, where we're seeing plant populations that are isolated, meaning that they're not able to, there's no gene flow between different populations. So once they're isolated for long enough, that can help facilitate becoming a new species, but that's going to be a long, long time. We won't see it in our lifetime, probably not, but that's a great question. So with this change in climate and trying to adapt to these different types of weather conditions, we are going to start seeing populations isolating from one another. And I know in the literature, we're seeing things like that, where populations morphologically and also sometimes genetically are becoming more isolated, where if you introduce them back together, they won't be able to reproduce because they're so genetically different. But that's a pathway. That's a great question. Yep.
Well, great, thank you. And so I just wanted to do some plant shout outs and botanical adventures. We had two people who have the same botanical love as you do with your houseplant, the pothos, Teresa and Rhea. So hello to them.
Hi.
We have Rochelle, who has air plants and orchids in the East Bay. I have to say I've tried to grow both of those and killed them. We have
orchids.
Jennifer's tried to, she has a maidenhair fern that she resurrected. And that's another plant that I have killed as well. So congratulations, Jennifer.
Yeah, being a botanist does not mean you have a green thumb. And I will say this pandemic has started my love of houseplants, but because I work within a greenhouse and so many plants outside of my house, I really didn't have a lot of plants inside my house until the pandemic.
Well, it's looking pretty good in your background.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Tanisha, and thank you for sharing your plant adventure. And so our next speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Laura Lagomarsino. I'll invite her to come on. Hello, Laura.
Hey, how are you doing, Nathalie?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for joining us. So Laura is an assistant professor at Louisiana State University. And Laura, can you tell us about your favorite houseplant and your botanical?
Yeah, I brought it with me. It's kind of big, or heavy, I guess. It is Stapelia gigantea, and it doesn't look super special right now, but my first slide will give away it's very special, the most special part of it. As the specific epithet suggests, gigantea, it produces a really big giant flower, and it's a carrion mimic that looks like dead meat and even smells like dead meat. So when these big giant flowers that last just one day bloom in our front yard, immediately all these little flies start coming to it and laying their eggs in it, and there's even like maggots in it by the end of the day, and I love it.
Where did you get it from?
Oh, this is a really special plant to me. So a very good friend of mine who's also a botanist, he's a former curator at the New York Botanical Garden, Robin Moran, gave it to me from a cutting. It's a plant that's really easy to propagate from cuttings, and I've been able to give lots of cuttings to my friends too. So it's really great.
Oh, that's lovely. Share the botanical love.
Exactly.
Well, with that, I'm going to leave it up to you, Laura, and you can tell us all about your botanical adventures in South America.
Yeah. Great. So let's see. There it goes. See, isn't that a very cool flower, that Stapelia here? They might be from South Africa. I'm not sure. But let me see. I'm going to tell you about my botanical adventures in the Andes. So before I tell you about my fieldwork, I'm going to try to justify it a little bit. So the American tropics, or I'll call them Indo-tropics for the New World tropics, are the most species-rich part of the world, with between 90 to 100,000 plant species that are native there. And to put this in a global context, this means that the American tropics may hold more species than all other tropical areas of the world combined. And the Andes, that very long mountain chain, the longest north-south oriented mountain chain in the entire world, is a really important component of that.
especially that tropical component, which is a biodiversity hotspot within a biodiversity hotspot. So despite covering less than 1% of the world's terrestrial surface at 1.5 million square kilometers, the tropical Andes house 40,000 plant species, about half of those that are endemic, found nowhere else in the world. So just really special region. And of course, it's a really region for everybody as well. It's beautiful, and here are some really special places within the Andes, like Suma Paz Paramo in Colombia, the Cotopaxi volcano in Ecuador, Machu Picchu down there in Peru, that UNESCO World Heritage Site in Incan ruins, and Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. And of course, with all that species richness comes some amazing fauna. Just like Tanisha, I guess I decided I wanted to show off some of the more famous animals of the Andes. And that includes things like alpacas and their domesticated relatives, the llamas, the spectacled bear, and a whole bunch of really cool birds like the swordbill hummingbird, the cock of the rock, these really cool flamingos with their amazing displays, and the Andean condor, which has a wingspan, I think that's more than 6 feet long, just a really big bird and very impressive. But I'm not here to talk about animals, I'm here to talk about plants. And Andean plants are just as special, if not more special, than those animals. And include some pretty yummy foods. You can make a really decent salad with quinoa, tomatoes, and a whole variety of potatoes that are native to the Andes. And while corn itself is native to Mexico, not the Andes, there are a lot of varieties that are really distinctive that have been cultivated there too. And I can't talk about Andean plants without talking about coca. This is a plant that is super controversial for its narcotic properties, but it's a really important plant culturally, especially in the central Andes in Bolivia and Peru. And as a tourist who gets altitude sickness when I go to La Paz from sea level here in Louisiana all the way up to almost 5,000 feet, 5,000 meters, I definitely can use a cup of coca tea. And I'm recovering from my second Pfizer dose right now. And instead of having this California Academy mug filled with mint tea, I'd probably opt for coca if I was in Peru today. But I can't, of course. And there's also a fantastic amount of diversity that might be less familiar to you if you don't know Andean flora. Things like bromeliads, a bunch of cacti, believe it or not, heliconias, passion flowers, princess flower relatives, and as per request on Twitter, the Colombian wax palm there in the center. Just a really spectacular plant. Just a really interesting structure there. And so this amazing diversity inspires the questions that we ask in my lab. All of them sort of inspired by this really broad question: what explains this American tropical hyperdiversity? And so members of my lab are tackling these questions from lots of different angles in all these really awesome study groups that you see around us. But to answer those questions, you need to get into the field and collect data, whether that's morphological data, or on the right side of this slide, here you see pieces of leaves in the desiccant silica gel. This is what botanists use to be able to extract really good DNA out of dried plant tissue, and it's something we definitely use in the field. And probably the most important reason that we collect or that we go to the field is to make herbarium specimens. These are these vouchered dried pressed plant specimens that are basically museum a museum specimen, a museum artifact of plants. They're going to be vouchered in perpetuity in herbarium collections, and they have really important information there, both in the dried plant itself as well as in the label data, as you see down here. And this is a specimen of Lobelia cardinalis collected in the San Bernardino Mountains and currently housed at the California Academy of Sciences. And our host today, Nathalie Nagalingum, is the botany curator at California Academy of Sciences. And maybe someday one of the plants that I collect in the field will end up under her control. So how do I get to the field? Well, the first step is you have to apply for permits. So biodiversity is controlled under the Convention for Biological Diversity, and you have to have a well-justified reason for collecting plants, especially if you're going to do genetic work. So that's a little bit of a hurry up and wait situation. But while that's going on, you want to identify in-country collaborators that will help you get your fieldwork goals accomplished. Folks from the countries where you want to do fieldwork know the flora, know the cultures, know the customs, and really should be involved at all levels of your fieldwork. And so here, Daniel, John, and Moises have helped me in Costa Rica, Peru, and Bolivia, and it's been a lot of fun working with them. I want to give a specific shout out to Daniel. You'll see him show up a lot of my slides. He helped me in my first field trip when I was a graduate student, and we've been married for a decade now. So he's been with me through a bunch of my field experiences, which is really special. After you have your permits, after you sort of have your plan, the next step is to gather all your gear. And that's not insignificant. You need a lot of stuff when you do field work: silica gel, Sharpie pens, clippers, boots, cameras, everything. And so you can imagine it takes a bunch of checked bags to get to the field. But once you're there, you're ready to hit the road. But even additional stuff is probably going to be piled up on top of the car. Here I'm showing some of the plant presses that we take to the field with us that make it so that we're able to make the herbarium specimens as good as possible when we're in the field. And once the car's ready, you're ready for 5, which a friend of mine recently referred to as drive, collect, drive, collect, drive, collect, drive, collect. As somebody who's interested in evolutionary biology across species and across entire geographies, a major goal of many of my field trips is just to cover distance. So I spend a lot of time collecting from my car, or I don't drive all the time, but I've been in cars at the top of mountains and lower down on the mountains where there's true forest, even inside of the forest. Here with Cyphocampus boliviensis right there in the middle of the street, very convenient. And a bunch of the plants that I collect that grow happily on the side of the road very conveniently, like Cyphocampus citrinus here in yellow, and then also Cyphocampus umbellatus here. That photo illustrates something else that happens when you're doing field work on the roadsides. You attract the attention of locals, old and young. These kids had a lot of really great questions for us, but we're really excited to be giftful snack pack of Oreos while we were telling them all about these cool flowers that this weird Dr. Seuss plant produces. Sometimes the plants on the side of the road are slightly harder to get to. There's some scrambling up that needs to happen. But I was kind of alarmed going through my photos in the last couple of days putting this talk together, how many times I put my husband's life at risk. Here he is in this first photo with a rope literally tied around his waist, trying to get to a plant down a pretty steep. I do not recommend that for those of you at home. And here he is, a slightly more reasonable distance. You can see the flowers right in the bottom right corner of that photo he was going for. The car itself can be really useful getting to plants that are just slightly out of reach. But of course, when we can leave the car behind, we do like to do that. And a lot of the places where I do field work, the roads aren't super well, there aren't super well developed trail systems. And so I end up not being able to do a whole lot of collecting on trails just because it simply doesn't exist. Another complication is that often you need even more special permits to do field work in protected areas. And so often I'm not able to do field work in those places. However, we've had a lot of help from private landowners, like this Peruvian farmer who let us collect plants on his farm after we crossed this river in this kind of fun setup. Once we've collected the plants, the next step is to go ahead and press them. And botanists use newspaper. That is the official way that we collect plants. And here you see Daniel and Moises putting together a specimen of Cyphocampus here. And they're making sure that the flowers are super visible, that there's a top side of the leaf and a bottom side of the leaf all ready for to be organized and processed in downstream steps. And I have a lot of photos like this because I do a lot of card-side trip collecting. Here's me collecting a passion flower in heliconia on the side of the road here. And here we are with Papa Pepe, our collaborators, father-in-law helping us out in Peru. But after we have those the plants, we have to keep going. It's not the end of the day yet. You still have to process specimens after you've collected them. And that often involves spending long nights after an already long day, labeling your specimens, making sure that each have a collection number attached to them, and that you get any data that you need from them that you're not going to be able to get once they are pressed and dried. So that might be noting the color of a flower. It might be making sure you have enough tissue and silica gel for any sort of work you need to do with their DNA. And then one other thing you have to do, and this is maybe the most important thing you'll do in the entire collection trip, is to take detailed collection notes. This information, including locality information with GPS points and elevation and descriptions of plants, that end up on that final herbarium specimen. So it's the permanent record of the specimens you collect. After that, after the notes are finished, you can finally put your plants in the dryer and crack open a pasena and get some rest in for the night. This photo was taken in Bolivia, and in Bolivia, it's customary to dry the specimens as you're collecting them in the field. So this apparatus you see here is a plant dryer, and inside of it are plants inside plant presses being dried. And here, I want to point your attention to this little propane tank. It's actually connected to a camp stove down below. So what's heating up these plants and drying them is an open flame. In other countries like Costa Rica and Peru, it's much more common to collect plants in alcohol. So what you do is after you have those plants in newspaper, you're going to just wrap them up tight, put them in a plastic bag, and douse them with alcohol. It could be isopropyl alcohol, could be the cheapest rum you can find, but just something to keep it so that it's not going to mold as they're waiting to be dried in an herbarium. So many herbaria have plant dryers where you can dry the plants using electricity and not an open flame, and it is a little bit safer. After you have your plants in the dryer, you've had your pasena, you can finally get some rest. And the places where I've slept are very variable because we are driving in cars. Often I'll stay at mini hotel rooms in a single field trip just because we're going from place to place. And sometimes we luck out and we get this really nice place with a beautiful view and a great breakfast and a comfortable bed. But just as often we end up in a place where whatever the opposite of this is, that's what we get. Little exposed wires and black mold situation notwithstanding. You might want to get some food too. For me, it's most typical that I'm going to be chewing on a sandwich or something very simple. I'm outside of a restaurant because my North American stomach often can't handle the roadside restaurants, and I end up preferring to just have simple food and not threaten my intestinal fortitude during these trips. But sometimes it is great to be able to make your own bowl of pasta, even if you are in a room with no electricity in the cold, high elevation Andes. Then you're just going to repeat it until you get all the plants you need. From the Nevados in the highest Andes, yes, there is snow in the Andes, to the Yungas at lower elevations with these awesome tree ferns as being part of the dominant vegetation. You're going to see some cool plant-animal interactions along the way and some cool geology too. It's always great to look for the plants that I study along river bends. So it's great to stop by any creek or quebrada you might find. And of course, there's going to be plenty of pristine cloud forest along the way. And once your flight is nearing or your car is full, it's time to pack up and head back to the major city. And at that point, you're going to want to wrap up everything you're doing in the local herbarium. At that point, what you most want to do is print out labels so that they can go right into those newspapered specimens. And if you have the time, you're going to want to annotate specimens, meaning if you're a taxonomic expert in any group, put on your identification. Say if you agree with what other people are, and try to curate the herbarium a little bit so that it'll be even better for the next person who comes by. After that, you're almost done, but you have to apply for permits again, this time to export the permits to the US. And that takes a while, but eventually your specimens will get back to you in whatever herbarium you're at internationally. And with specimens, you're able to do science. So with the research that I conducted through the field work I presented was able to result in the first phylogeny, or set of evolutionary relationships, for this really cool radiation of plants called the neotropical bellflowers. Here I also showed that the uplift of the Andes themselves was able to drive really, really rapid rates of diversification in this group, and that was spurred by relationships with fruit dispersers and by pollinators. I was further able to show that pollination syndrome, so whether flowers are pollinated by, in this group, bats or hummingbirds, was very evolutionary labile. From a hummingbird pollinated ancestor, bat pollination, and these kind of cool green flowers up here, evolved 14 times independently. And so I'm just going to really briefly wrap up talk about another kind of fieldwork I also engage in, this one related to pollination. Here's a photo of a bat pollinating a Burmeister species taken by my postdoc advisor, Nathan Muchala. And inspired by that phylogeny I just showed you with hummingbird and bat pollination being so labile on that series of evolutionary relationships, we wanted to understand what role this might play in speciation. And so we headed to the Death Road in Bolivia, a road that maybe you've seen on Top Gear, very curvy and narrow. And we were able to do field work right off of that road. It was a lot of fun. And we ended up staying in an abandoned train station there while we conducted this field work. No electricity, no running water, but it was a really good structure to stay in. And a rural indigenous family gave us permission to stay there and rented us some straw beds to sleep on. It was a really kind of a luck situation. It was pretty great. And while we were there, we were able to document some fantastic species interactions, like the Centropogon and Canis being visited by a bat species. And so through this research, we're able to provide further insights into how neotropical diversity originates. The Andes themselves, that amazing mountain chain with all its habitat heterogeneity, provided a lot of opportunities for these groups to speciate, potentially using different pollinators like we see in the neotropical bellflowers. And so with that, I want to say gracias to Nathalie and to everyone at CalACAD who's put this together, to everyone who's helped me in the field, and with my new vaccine, of course, the vaccine developers and healthcare workers out there, getting them in arms, because it means that I'll be able to go to the field next year after all, and which is especially great news because the National Science Foundation just funded a grant between me and two collaborators, Rosanna Zaniel Ferguson and Rachel Schwartz, to continue this branch of research in the Andes. So thank you.
Congratulations, Laura, on your grant. It's incredible. Like, to get a grant from the National Science Foundation there's like a tiny percentage of people get a grant, and so huge congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited.
It's really big. It's a big deal.
Yeah, we can't wait to go to Colombia.
Well, when you do, we would love to have your specimens in our herbarium.
Awesome. I love it.
Million, and so we always have species missing, and we definitely would welcome more.
Awesome. I love it. We'll be in touch.
Great. Thank you. And so there's lots of questions and many praises for you in our chat.
Great.
You kind of touched on this, but somebody wanted to know how important it is to understand how the plants are affected by and affect the native animals.
Oh, I think it's hugely important. A lot of the time I'm thinking on this macroevolutionary scale, and so much of the Andean biodiversity is connected to species interactions, right? When you think of passion flowers, you think of also the butterflies that eat on them, right? Even if you grow a passion flower here in the US, they're always attracting butterflies. Hummingbird pollination has been really important in the Andes. Just, we have a little bit in the US, but it's just, so much more down in the Andes. And I think that is really thinking in deep time. I think that these intricate interactions have really generated a lot of the diversity. And of course, thinking forward, as we think about how things are changing in this era of climate change and anthropogenic change, which is definitely a problem in the regions where I do research, those relationships will become more and more mismatched and put things at risk of extinction, just kind of like Tanisha was talking about. So yeah, it's really important, I think.
And what about seed dispersers as well? Are there animals that disperse seeds?
Yeah, absolutely. Seed dispersers are so important. Unlike pollination and some of those herbivory relationships, dispersal tends to be a little less specific. And so a plant that relies on birds for dispersal might be able to use, you know, a dozen kind of birds, dozen species of birds, and not just a single species of bird that, or a single species of pollinator that some plants might rely on. So I think with seed dispersal, there's probably a little bit more flexibility in those relationships. But of course, that then opens up the ability to maybe disperse even further outside of a range. But yeah, I think those are all super important interactions to try to preserve and to understand.
Thank you. And we have a question about the political realities of countries that you visit.
Yeah.
Does that affect where you go and do your fieldwork? Some, and in terms of biopiracy as well, where some governments don't let you sample. Can you talk about sort of those issues?
Absolutely. So I guess the first issue is safety. You definitely have to consider that. There are some areas where it's not safe. I think the country where I will be going to next is Colombia. And in the past, Colombia was a pretty dangerous country to be because of the FARC. There's still areas of Colombia where it's best not to go, especially if you look like me. But it's so much safer than it used to be. But you have to be aware of the political reality in your country. And so right now, for example, going to Venezuela is sort of off the it's not really an option right now. But then, yes, biopiracy, that's the other side of that question about biopiracy is really important too. And countries really want to protect their biological diversity. This tends to be for economic use and not so much for the basic science that I do, but basic science often needs to be considered under the same regulations as the research for profit. And so with that, countries have really different ways of handling their biological diversity. In some countries, it's really almost impossible to get a permit to do field work. But in others, it's easier, especially, and I think this is really important, if you have an in-country collaborator. I think it's really important in general when we do field work internationally that we're not parachute scientists, that we're not coming in and just taking without giving. And so part of, I think, respecting laws around biological diversity is giving back to a local community however you can, and making sure. So when I collect herbarium specimens, and anyone, you're supposed to leave the best set of specimens in that country, wherever it is, and export, you know, the second string herbarium specimens back to the US or wherever. And I respect that.
Yeah,
so
I'm glad you mentioned
really
that.
variable.
Thank you, yeah.
Yeah.
That we call them duplicates. So you leave a duplicate in the country where you visited.
Yeah.
And then so something I just want to mention is that we have LGBTQ colleagues who are limited in where they can go. In some countries there are laws and that would put them in danger and in jail, and so that is a hard reality that many LGBTQ scientists have to face, unfortunately. And I just want people to be aware of that too. That's an issue for other people.
Absolutely. There's a really good website that shows sort of the countries that have laws related to that. And maybe I'll try to find it and I'll put it into the YouTube chat if people want to follow along.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And then we have some shout outs for some more plants. We have some Staphylia cat who brought one to work and she became very unpopular when she did that. Who said, and I quote, "I'm not sure I would want a plant that smells like dead meat in my house." So,
they have character. They're fantastic, but you can put them outside.
That's true.
Let you know with plenty of time in advance. Their bud is about like as big as my head, so
okay.
You can put them out.
Okay, so they're not so bad as houseplants.
Yeah.
And then we have Carol, who also has a second vote for pothos as well, just like Tanisha. We have Rowan, who, well, actually Rowan's mum, who has philodendron, and Rowan has a Rhaphidophora. And Gary has a Sensivaria.
Lovely. We
So
have a good diversity of houseplants in this,
we do.
in this
So
event. I love it.
Please keep telling us about your houseplants. If you have any Andean houseplants or garden plants, please let us know. And with that, I will say thank you so much to Laura.
Thank you. I appreciated it.
Thanks for taking us to the Andes. And so next, I'd like to bring up Dr. Dory Contreras. Hello, Dory.
Hi, Natalie.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Where are you calling us from?
Calling from Dallas, Texas. Well, near Dallas, Texas. I'm in some mid-cities, the Metroplex,
Okay.
if you will.
Over on that side.
Yeah.
So Dory's a curator of Paleobotany. She used to be at Berkeley, so we were kind of neighbours, and I would see her once in a while. And now she's at the Perot Museum of Nature and Science. And so that's I think, pretty recent posting. So congratulations on your newish job.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a little over a year, though, of course, shortly after landing here, the pandemic hit. So, but yeah, it's been great.
Well, can you tell us about your favorite houseplant? Did that houseplant come with you, or is it a new one?
This did come with me. It's not an indoor houseplant. I don't have any indoor plants because I have a cat that refuses to let anything green live indoors. So this is, I brought it from outside. I do have some outside that are potted. I do a lot of native plant gardening, but this was a traveler from California with me. It's big for a bonsai, but this is my lovely elm bonsai tree, which is, I'm trying to get it in the camera. I'm doing a bad job. It just leafed out, and it does need some shaping and a repotting, but it's got these precious, tiny, tiny, tiny little elm leaves. And this one's about 18 years old. So a pretty old tree. It's got nice bark. I don't know if the lighting shows that well in there, and the little mini tree at the bottom. But this one's my favorite. I've had many other bonsais die. And this one has lived. So
18 years, that's a long time, Dory.
I know. Well, I got it when it was already pretty old. And I've managed not to kill it. And the big freeze we had just managed to not kill it either. So I was worried I was going to lose him for sure doing that, but nope.
Wonderful. That's a recurring theme with us, is that we're scared of, like, we kill plants and we're scared of killing plants.
Yeah, surprisingly not as green of thumb as we'd hoped. I'm getting better. I'm better at the outdoor gardening, but that's a lot of just plant selection. Choose native plants and they grow well. They're harder to kill in your region.
That's true. That's a special tip from Dora today.
Yeah, special tip. Choose native plants for your region.
Thank you. Well, can you, we'll bring up your presentation and I'll speak to you afterwards.
All right, sounds great. All right, well, make it a nice laser pointer here. Make it easier to see. For my adventures in botany, I want to talk about tropical forest in the past and in the present. So as a paleobotanist, I've been really fortunate to be able to work both in living forest, like this one here in the lowland tropical forest of Costa Rica, as well as tropical forests that are entombed in rock, ancient tropical forest. And so here's a picture of New Mexico, which I'll take you to a little later in the talk to look at tropical forests there. Now, I've worked in both of these very different environments to study tropical forest. And in both cases, I was looking at leaves, studying living leaves or fossil leaves to basically understand and rebuild the ecology of forest. So I thought for this talk, what might be fun is to kind of take a behind the scenes look at what it's like to work in these very, very different environments in the living forest, what it's like to do field work there, what it's like to do field work in fossil forest, and then also kind of touch on what some of the fun wildlife and other encounters you have while botanizing in these two very, very different locations. So first we'll travel to Costa Rica, the lowland tropical forest there, where I had the absolute pleasure to work for 2 summers at the La Selva Biological Research Station and work in these long-term forest monitoring plots that were looking at the overall studies. We're aiming to look at how forests regenerate from disturbance. So we looked at, there's plots of old growth forests, there's plots of secondary growth forest, and these are forests that are recovering from disturbance, things like fire or logging, or livestock was grazing them, whatever disturbed kind of the more native forest. And here they're just kind of separated by a trail. So you can see they, after eventual time, they end up looking pretty similar. And so I was working in these forests to study specific tree species, a whole set of them, ones that specialized in secondary growth forests, so they occurred more prevalently there, ones that occurred more prevalently in old growth forests, and then also some that we call generalist. And these were trees that are kind of really popular in both old growth and secondary forests. And I won't go too big into the species. My job there was collecting leaves from these species, and then I do a bunch of different measurements on these leaves to learn about their ecology and understand better why some specialize in secondary growth and others in old growth. Now, I will go ahead and mention my favorite species of it, so we get one little botanical insight. And my favorite species working with, and this was one of the generalists, was called a Varroa cochnei, and this is in the family the Myristicaceae. So this is the family that also has nutmeg in it. As a nice fun fact. And this one was my favorite just because it was a fun species to work with. It had these absolutely gorgeous leaves, really large, really fun to sample, really great to measure and work with, but also these really cool fruits. And there were these bivalve fruits with a fleshy inside and then a big old seed in the center that was surrounded by this really bright red aril. So just really pretty to see. But one of the coolest things that always stuck with me about it is that if you nicked the bark of the tree and you got to its sap, the sap that exudes out of it was just this bright red. It was one of the ways you could check your ID as you're looking at leaves way high in the canopy. If you nick it and it was red, that was the Varroa. It looks like the tree's bleeding. So it was a really neat, kind of a neat thing about it. Okay, so I'm studying all these species out there. Well, how do we go about collecting leaves from these trees in the rainforest? Well, we're working on this pretty nice field station at La Selva. So we had this home base, and there was a system of trails that kind of led out at least a little bit of a distance from, the main base. And we had all these old growth and secondary growth forest plots kind of far out from the station. So we'd load up our packs and all our gear, get on bikes. That was a nice new bike that year, got on bikes, and we'd ride out on these trail system as far as we could go before having to ditch our bikes in the woods and hike the rest of the way. And of course, this is assuming that there wasn't calamity along the way, like a tree fall that happened the night before that then blocks the path. But either way, we'd get out there to our forest plots. Once you're in the plot, you're off trail, you're inside this plot that has kind of a grid system that allows you to find your way and not get totally lost in the rainforest. And once you get out there, you start hunting for your specific tree species. So this is me hunting. It's a lot of looking up at the canopy. So even though I was sampling understory leaves, they're still basically high up. So you're tramping around the forest, looking up, trying to find things. And the way we collect leaves from the canopy is, well, my tool of choice was this pruner pole. So this is a telescoping pruner pole. On the end, you've got the little pruner. It's got a rope pulley attached to it. So you hook it over a branch, you pull the rope, it slices it off, and you end up with a little section of branch with some leaves on it that while you're in the field, you pack up in Ziploc bags to keep them moist, take them back to the lab, and the next day you run a whole battery of measurements on it to get the information that you need. Now, it is the rainforest and things are tall, so even though I was sampling understory leaves, these leaves were still really high up. And most typically, I was having to use the pole fully extended to get the lowest branch on a tree. So this pole telescopes to, I think it was 16 feet. So 16 feet plus my height is kind of where we're hitting some of the lowest branches for the species that I was sampling. I'm not very tall. I'm like a little over 5 foot, but still, it's pretty high for some of the lowest branches. So it was a nice little balancing act getting that pole up there. And this became pretty hairy situations of sampling sometimes. My colleague actually took this picture of me when I was in a real thicket trying to get this one species I had been hunting really hard. And I was actually standing on top of a giant tree that had fallen. So climbed up on a tree fall, which you can't see under my feet here, and then had to use the pole and still barely got that thing. So quite interesting situation sampling those leaves. And of course, you do this over and over and over, take tons of measurements, and then eventually you can analyze it and figure out, kind of answer your research questions. Now, of course, working in the tropical rainforest is a pretty amazing experience. It's super diverse, of course, and not just from the plants, but of course, super diverse animals. So all these are pictures that I took. Some look like stock photos, right? But there's just an incredible diversity of wildlife that you're constantly encountering. Really beautiful poison dart frogs to venomous and non-venomous snakes. That's what you're always trying to watch out for, which as a botanist can be tricky because you're looking up all the time and really you got to do a lot of looking down to watch out for the snakes. Spiders, you get tarantulas. These plots were just full of golden orb spiders, which sometimes tramping around looking up, I would all of a sudden find myself, this happened on a couple of occasions, just surrounded by golden orb webs. And I would think, how did I even get right here that I'm completely 360 surrounded by webs? It's kind of mind-boggling. But anyway, lots of beautiful moths, butterflies, birds, of course. This toucan is actually eating a frog in that picture, so you get that full National Geographic experience. And then monkeys. So here's a spider monkey. They were really fun to spot. There were a lot of howler monkeys out there as well. A little note on encountering monkeys in the forest. They are quite ornery. They don't want you to be where they are. So like this one in this picture, right after I snapped this, he grabbed this palm fruit and flung it down at us. And that was kind of a typical occurrence in encountering monkeys. Groups of howler monkeys would throw seeds down and knock branches down at the trees if you were trying to kind of get at trees that were around or under them. So really, really kind of fun to encounter, but you got to watch out. Now, out of all the animals, though, encountering, the thing that kind of sticks out pretty memorably for me are the ants. And there's a lot of ants in the rainforest, of course, and that's fine. Leafcutter ants, all kinds of tiny ants doing all kinds of ant business all of the time. But the ones that stand out are the bullet ants. And a bullet ant is its common name. It's called a lot of different common names. Bullet ant is one, 24-hour ant is another. But either way, they get their name because they have a reputation for being one of the world's worst, or the world's worst, insect sting. And these are big ants. And they live in colonies at the bases of trees and then go scout about. And they actually travel solitary. They're not like leafcutter ants where they travel in nice little lines. Each one of these worker ants will just be out roaming around on its own. Under foliage, around foliage, they're just kind of around. So they seemingly are everywhere if there's colonies around. And they're giant. And they have these giant pincers. The pincers aren't what gets you. It's the stinger on the back. And so these are something you usually try to avoid. But I ended up having a reputation and became a running joke. But the bullet ants loved me. When we say loved me, don't know if I'd say loved me. Maybe they hated me. But I got stung 6 different times over the course of my work there in Costa Rica. As different occasions, stung by bullet ants. And I can attest pretty confidently that it is not fun at all. You might say some words. Now, I don't know if I'd say it's as bad as getting shot by a bullet, as the name implies. Granted, I haven't been shot by a bullet, but I'd imagine a bullet's much worse than what they felt like. but they have a neurotoxin. So it's a long-lasting pain from the sting. So over the rest of your day is pretty much messed up. You're not going to get as much work as you want done. You'll be a little brain fuzzy and you go through waves of pain. So pretty inconvenient little guys. And I'll share two kind of quick stories about two of the times I was stung by bullet ants. One because it was a double sting, and the other one because the bullet ant basically might have saved me. And so the first one, I was out in a plot working and I got stung in the arm. And I knew what it was instantly because this was not the first time. And I was said some words. I looked for the ant, couldn't find it anywhere. So I figured it was off me and I go about my business. Angrily, but I go about my business. 2 minutes later, I get stung in my side. And so, it's still on me. So I strip off my shirt, take it off, flip it around looking for the ant. And this is what I find, which just blew my mind. This ant was wildly stinging. He was super angry because apparently he was in like a death grip lock with another ant, which is now just its head. Its body was missing. It was locked on to the antenna of this ant, thus its anger and just kind of wild stinging action as it couldn't get free from this other ant head. But yeah, this is what turned out had somehow gotten in my shirt, and I was the innocent bystander that got the brunt of whatever fight they were having. And this is so you get a good idea of the size of these bullet ants. This is my friend's thumb. I tried to get him to put it in the picture for scale, and that's as close as he would get it. He was like shaking, trying to get it any closer. But yeah, I thought that was a pretty wild situation. Now, the other time that a bullet ant really helped me out was when I had actually gone off plot, gotten kind of lost, and the bullet ant stung my thigh. And in my basically anger stupor of getting stung, stumbled up a hillside and ended up finding my way back into a plot and near my colleagues. So I was kind of lost before that thing happened. So in a way, helped me out. But that's kind of the wild encounters while working in the living tropics. We can move now to what it's like working in the completely different environment of tropical forest in the past. And so here is what is now New Mexico. This is South Central New Mexico. And you can see it's not a tropical forest now. Clearly, this is Chihuahuan Desert. We have no forest. The biggest trees you get are junipers. Otherwise, you're stuck with things like creosote and ephedra, little bunch grasses, things like that. But the tropical forest that I was studying, the ancient tropical forest, is actually Cretaceous in age. And if we go all the way back to the Cretaceous, this was a much different world at this time. It was a whole lot warmer. We didn't have any ice caps on the poles. Sea levels were higher. You've got flooded interiors of continents as a result. And you had tropical climates that basically extended up into the lower mid-latitudes where now we have more temperate climates. So this is how we can find a tropical forest and tropical landscapes in places like New Mexico now. Now, not only was this a different climate, but just a reminder, the late Cretaceous is dinosaur time. So this is also the time period where we have dinosaurs and things tramping around the forest. From a plant evolution standpoint, this was also a super cool and very important time for plants. The flowering plants, which is what dominates our world today and which completely dominates modern tropical forest, had just evolved, spread across the globe, and they were starting to slowly take over forest. Before that, it was forest full of conifers and ferns and other plants, but this was the time that the flowering plants really started to turn forest into their more modern form. And that's the time period that I'm interested in, trying to understand these forests in that transitional point. So that's where I ended up in New Mexico here. We're going to zoom into the western interior to look at where I did field work and studies there. So here's that western interior kind of blown up with the seaway going through the US. And so the fossil flora I'm about to take you to is here, South Central New Mexico. And it's an incredible fossil forest, 75 million years old, that basically was preserved because these volcanoes over to the west of it, in these mountain building events, erupted, showered ash over the landscape, over a tropical forest, burying it, which subsequently fossilized and basically preserved in an instant in time of a forest across a landscape. And then eventually, many, many millions of years later, we get to today, and that has uplifted again, and that layer of ash here that entombs this ancient forest has been re-exposed. And re-exposed over a whole kilometer long hillside. And so we basically have like a transect or a walk through a 75 million year old forest that if you can get the forest out of the rock, you can see what it was. So how do we get the forest out of the rock? The $1 million question. Well, not with pruner poles this time. We attack it with totally different tools. We attack it with hammers, with pry bars, with pickaxes, sledges. The rock is really hard, so it takes quite heavy-duty tools. And how do we kind of rebuild that forest? Well, for that whole kilometer-long walk, we dig what we call quarries out of that rock. So we pull all the rock out of these kind of discrete sampling locations. We bust it up with hammers to break open the rock and expose the fossils. And here you have fossil leaves exposed on that plane. And the rock will break preferentially along those bedding planes, along the fossils. So that's what you end up with. And we do that a lot. We pull everything out. We lay all the fossils out that we find. We count them. We identify them and study them, take them back to museums to basically then analyze and figure out what this forest looked like, put it back together. Well, just in a nutshell, for this one, since you can't actually see the forest, I'll show a few of the fossils. It turned out to be one of the most diverse floras that we know from the Cretaceous period at all. Is extremely diverse, all kinds of flowering plants, conifers, ferns, cool things. When we look at kind of what the most prevalent plants there are, we kind of really get a picture of this really diverse ancient tropical forest that we call a non-analog forest. And what that means is that it had in it plants, a combination of plants that we don't see today. So it had in it redwoods, relatives of the modern redwoods that are like on the California coast, but also fan palms and gingers that formed a ground cover on the understory. Lots of other fossil plants, extinct weird conifer groups that we don't even have today. So just a really weird combination of plants making a really diverse tropical forest in the past. Of course, working in there, you're not covered by an overstory. Kind of the biggest thing that you face when you are doing field work there out in the desert is the sun. It's the sun and the dry air. So this was probably the biggest tree we encounter on that outcrop. It's a juniper, and this was a very nice afternoon nap in the shade that we got, but usually we weren't so lucky as to be under shade. Turns out creosote doesn't make much shade, so you got to go find a juniper. As far as wildlife, you still get a pretty cool array of wildlife out in the desert. Venomous and non-venomous snakes, big ol' spiders, cool predatory birds, lizards, but you also get jackrabbits and cottontails, as well as quail, and coyote. Those are some of my favorites. As far as dangerous encounters, luckily I never got stung by anything meaningful out there, though I did have some run-ins with rattlesnakes. That's the thing you really got to worry about out there. You're working in these rock walls, and I encountered a really big rattlesnake behind this particular block. After I pried it off the wall, I had trapped it between me and this wall back here by about 2 feet. Didn't notice until I heard its rattle and hiss, and that sent me running, jumping down the hillside there. But that's kind of the biggest thing you really face out in the desert, is watching out for rattlesnakes for the most part. And that's kind of in a little very quick nutshell, with some adventures working in tropical forest in the living world and tropical forest in the fossil world is like. Two very different but fun environments. And with that, I'd like to say thanks, of course, lots of funding and things sent me out to these places, NSF, as well as a number of smaller organizations. But also, I want to say if you're in Dallas ever, you should come visit us at the Perot Museum of Nature and Science. We've got an amazing and architecturally cool building, 5 floors of exhibits, including a really nice fossil hall where you can see more about Cretaceous ecosystems and some cool Cretaceous environments. And with that, thank you all.
Thank you, Dory. I hope to come and visit you one day and see the Perot too.
Yes, now that hopefully in the future when we can travel soon.
So one of the questions I had was, why did you decide to become a paleobotanist after seeing all those beautiful fossils of leaves? What inspired you to pursue paleobotany?
Yeah, so paleobotany is not something I ever thought about until I was well into college, and I had gone back to college after a previous life career. But I was always interested in plants. So I grew up around forest. I loved being in forest, and I went back to school to study botany, and really was interested in tropical ecology and things like that. But as I got more deep into plant courses, I became pretty fascinated with evolution of plants and the evolution of these ecosystems, and started thinking about their history, Earth history, and how these developed in time. And through that, I ended up getting involved in a fossil lab at Texas State University. So although I was in California before I came back to Dallas, I'm originally from Texas, but got involved in a lab that studied fossils while I was an undergrad, and then never stopped after that. It kind of opened up a lot of avenues for really understanding kind of past worlds and our current world. So.
Well, leading on from that, so in terms of our current world, someone asked that they heard that trees falling in rainforests are a big danger. Have you experienced any of that?
Oh, it's an extremely big danger. And it's not, yes. When you hear a tree fall, it is scary because you have to figure out if it's close enough to you that you're in trouble, because they're awfully big. So a big tree falling can fall, the canopy could be quite a bit away from the base. Luckily, I've not had one fall too close to me, but if you spend any time in a rainforest, you will hear tree falls, or anytime there's big rain or big gust of winds, you'll see the aftermath of it the next day, kind of like the tree that had fallen off across the trail that I had showed. The other thing you have to watch out for is not just the tree fall danger, but it's really falling branches, falling big seeds. I mean, some of the seeds in rainforest are big, and when that falls from, goodness, skyscraper height, if that hits you on the head, you're in trouble. So there's anything falling from the canopy is kind of a real dangerous situation. So you always got to kind of keep your ears open for, what might be raining down.
Well, that answers the other part of the question, was what are the other dangers outside of bull ants? And so you just answered that part of the question.
There's lots. Speaking of falling things from the sky, I was out, and my colleague that was with me had a real deathly fear of spiders, which the rainforest is not a great place for that fear. But out of the canopy, we hear a plop right on a leaf next to us, and we turn, and it was like the skeleton of a tarantula. And I thought he about was going to die. But that was another falling object, just barely missing you. It was just, it was already dead, so it was cool. But yeah.
And so someone else asked about permits, and you have to have permits for like live collections and dried collections, as Laura was telling us. But what about with fossils? Like, do you just like find it and keep it? Like, how does that work?
No, and don't, if you're out finding fossils, find out who owns the land. These things, you can't just collect them. So yeah, there's a whole permit process. If you're on federal land, state land, city land, you get a whole different processes, but you do need permits. You do need to make sure, wherever you're getting them from, that you're getting valid ownership from them. So I've worked also on private land, and in that case, the fossils coming to a museum are actually donated by the landowner. They do a deed of gift. It's like a charitable donation, donating the fossils if they're on their land. In most states, in the US at least, that means that you own the fossils if it's on your land. So you have to kind of arrange that with private landowners. But if it's public land, then yeah, there's permit processes that you apply for to be able to collect.
Okay, thank you for that warning and info. And so there's lots of people asking about doing field work and helping with field work. But I think, like you and me, we're all like, sheltering in place and not going anywhere. So one of the things that I thought people could do is take part in Notes from Nature expeditions. And so what they are is when people go into the field and collect specimens, what you can do is help transcribe those labels so we can include it in our databases. And we have huge we have huge collections, but that are not databased. And so I think Lynn and Christina are going to drop that link in the chat. So if anybody wants to help out on a virtual field trip, that would be really great. And then with that, I will do some more shout outs for some plants. We have Pamela, who has a peace lily, and Greg, who has a passiflora from UC Berkeley Botanic Garden. So just down the road from where you were, Dory, where you did your PhD. And so with that, I'll say thank you to Dory. Thanks for joining us all the way from Texas. And I will bring up my talk, and I will tell you about my Aussie adventures. And so, as you can tell from my accent, I am from Australia, and I'm from Melbourne in Victoria, which is in the bottom of the screen. The laser pointer, there we go. There's Victoria and Melbourne with the blue flag. And then before I moved to the academy, I was living in Sydney, and so here's Sydney with this flag, the blue flag as well, and it's in the state of New South Wales. I want to tell you all about my adventures across Australia, collecting cycads and collecting ferns. But as many of you know, Australia is pretty famous for having so many things that are going to kill you. And I was enjoying looking at all the memes about how different things in Australia can kill you. So these are a couple of things that I found. But it's definitely true. There are a lot of scary animals in Australia. And when I lived in Sydney, I was going to sleep one night, and this is actually my bedroom. And there was a huge spider that had taken residence just above the window. And this is actually what we call a huntsman spider. It looks super scary, but in fact, the venom is only a small amount of venom, and it's not dangerous to humans. And they're actually kind of scared of humans as well. So they really aren't as scary as they seem, although I have to admit I was scared. You can go around Australia, and this is in Queensland, the state of Queensland, which is in the northeast of Australia, and go to these beautiful places like Cairns. And here we see tourists who are taking photos on the beach. Cairns is a really popular site where people go to Cairns and then they go out to see the Great Barrier Reef. But here we're on the beach, but nobody is in the water. And the reason is because you see a sign like this, warning you not to swim because, yes, there are saltwater crocs that can kill you. And elsewhere in Australia, you can go to places like the 12 Apostles, and I visited here a couple of years ago. That's a few hours outside of Melbourne. It's pretty stunning, these stacks in the ocean. But when you go to somewhere like the 12 Apostles, you'll also get warnings about things like unstable cliffs and snakes as well. And definitely when you go out into the field, you can see snakes. And so I've seen snakes. Usually I see snakes when I go off and I have to pee somewhere, and there's usually a snake. I wouldn't say usually. It's whenever I've seen a snake, that's when I've seen one. And the thing is that these snakes are extremely dangerous. They can kill you. But the thing is, they're usually scared of humans. And so as long as you leave them alone, they will slither away. And so while I've seen them, I definitely haven't had any close encounters with them, thankfully. One of the places in Queensland that I visited is kind of like this, really dry and scrubby. And I was there with some Swedish colleagues to collect ferns. So one of the ferns that we collected was these pretty incredible basket ferns with these two kinds of leaves, those dried leaves at the bottom and then the leaves at the top. And so then what we did was collect all these various ferns, and my friend Petra, who is a professor at Uppsala University in Sweden, she said to me that she's like, is there something in my eye? And it had just started raining. And so I looked at her and there was a leech in her eye. It was a little tiny leech that had fallen and made its way into her eye. And so it's kind of like this, it's really sort of dense forest, and the leech had attached to her eyeball. I had tried to make a salt solution to try and get the leech out. That didn't work. And so Emma, who was a student with us, she actually went to Petra's eyeball and actually physically pulled off the leech. It worked, and Petra was totally fine, but we thought we better go see a hospital and make sure that she's going to be okay. So here we are, there's Petra getting an infusion of antibiotics because apparently there's lots of bacteria in the guts of leeches, and so they wanted to make sure that she didn't get any kind of infection. We also went to a specialist eye doctor this is like a tiny little bush hospital, and they checked her out, and actually I got to see the leech attachment on her eyeball with this special instrument. So that was pretty fascinating. But she also got her eyes checked out, and she's totally fine. But apparently it's a really common thing because botanists are weird and go out into the rain, and that's when leeches come and attach on your eyeball. And apparently what you're supposed to do is just let the leech completely feed and then drop off. I don't know about that, but we didn't do that. I've seen leeches on other field trips when I've collected cycads, for example, and here you can see my colleague Rick. He came to Australia to collect ferns, and here he was driving, and he noticed the leech. He stopped in the middle of the road and when he noticed this leech. Thankfully, we weren't on a busy road. It was in the middle of nowhere. And he pulled off the leech, and he wasn't allowed to drive for the rest of the field trip. But we then took a photo of the leech. Here it is, and it's actually called a tiger leech. And it was a pretty beautiful leech, I have to say, for a leech. But we also see other animals when we do field work and when we have our botanical adventures, like this giant moth that we saw in Queensland on that same field trip. You see flying foxes, which are fruit bats. They're also dangerous as well because, as we know all too well, bats contain viruses, and these bats contain a virus called the Hendra virus, which can kill a human, and they can kill horses as well. And so as long as you don't go near these bats, it's totally not a problem. Of course, we see all the iconic wildlife in Australia. I took this near a botanic garden outside of Melbourne. Here's a kangaroo mid-hop. We also see kangaroos in the wild, and this is outside of Victoria in a place called Wilson's Promontory. We see wallabies. That was at Wilson's Prom as well. We see wombats, which are as cute as this photo is. Oh, and I'll also say that all of the photos I'm showing you are photos that I took while I was in the field. I could have taken photos off the internet, but I wanted to show you photos and just show you the reality of what it's like in the field. And so this is a wombat that I saw again at Wilson's Prom. One of the highlights that I saw in the field was actually a platypus. And they actually look as weird as you think they do. They have that duck bill, and they have the webbed feet, but they have like this sort of almost rodent-like body. They're really, really hard to see in the wild. And so it was a thrill to actually see this platypus in the wild and get a photo of it too. We also see lots of birds in the wild, like this emu. there's so many birds in Australia that make these incredible sounds, and that's something that I really miss, is the sounds of all the birds, both in the city and in the bush. It's relatively pretty quiet when you're not in Australia and you don't hear any birds. And so this is a rosella, and it has that sort of distinct red and blue on it. And one of my favourites is the kookaburra, the sounds of the kookaburra, and also seeing kookaburras as well. Australia also has this very odd fascination with big things. And so when I'm in the field, I definitely will try and make a diversion or a side trip to go and see any big things. And so here I am with my colleague and friend Noah Whiteman, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, and we were collecting ferns. That's the one where we saw the wombats and the kangaroos, and so we made a stop to see the big banana. This is another field trip that I made 2 years ago, and when I was collecting cycads, and I had to make a trip to go and see the big mango, and that fence behind you is a normal size, 6-foot fence. So that's a big mango, also with an ant on it, you can see. We also have a giant cane toad that I went to see in Queensland, and there's giant everythings. And so this is one picture I did take from the web. I have seen the giant pineapple over here that's on the right. I've seen the giant rocking horse. I've seen the giant earthworm. But there are many other giant things to go and see in Australia. And I hope to see more of them soon. I think I've seen the giant prawn too. We also have, time to go and eat some really great food. And so this is what was called Lake Barine, which is actually an old volcanic crater that's filled in with water. And there we had scones with jam and cream. We get to go and have breakfast in nice cafes. And in this cafe in Byron Bay, we had breakfast with a bush turkey walking around us. In the Northern Territory in Darwin, there are pretty amazing night markets with lots of food. And there you can eat a range of Aussie foods, such as crocodile meat. You can eat pork with native figs and native plants, or you can eat kangaroo meat as well. And so it's not very common to eat these in Australia, but you can find them. The reason that I do all of this field work is to collect these plants called cycads. And they look like palms. So they have this stout trunk and they have a crown of leaves. And so they look like palms, but they're different from palms because they don't have flowers and they don't have fruits. So palms have fruits like dates and coconut. Cycads have cones and they have then produce seeds. So they're very different from palm plants. But they're commonly called palms. That's the common name, but scientifically they're different. They are found in many places. You can grow your own cycads as houseplant, and please let me know if anybody has a cycad as a houseplant. This is actually at Flora Grub Nursery here in San Francisco that you can purchase cycads. I've seen them growing all around San Francisco and the Bay Area. You can buy them at IKEA. You can buy them at Whole Foods. And you can see them used as landscaping. And so here at your favourite fast food joint, you can even find cycads. I'm a bit crazy, and wherever I see a cycad, I'll take a photo. But really, most cycads are super rare and very, very endangered. And in fact, out of all plant and animal groups on Earth today, cycads are the most endangered group, with 2/3 of their species on the red list, which is a list that compiles all of the species that are threatened with extinction. And so my research, it helps understand how these plants are becoming extinct, and we're trying to find ways to mitigate that extinction. And so in doing this, I have travelled many places in Australia. I've been up to what we call the top end here in Darwin and Katherine to collect cycads. And I've done a lot of field work all across Queensland. I'm driving all the way from Brisbane, not at the same time, of course, but driving all the way to Brisbane up to Cooktown. And so to give you an idea of how far that distance is, it's essentially driving from San Diego all the way to Vancouver. So it's pretty much the length of the US. And so Cooktown is pretty much the northernmost city in Australia. And in fact, this is what it looks like. So Cooktown, what you see in that picture is the extent of Cooktown. So it's not very big, and there are cycads that grow there, and so that's why I went. It's actually it's the end of the road in Australia. The roads are paved all the way up to Cooktown. From that point on, it's all dirt roads. And so here's my husband helping me collect cycads. He's my field assistant. So very similar to Laura, you know, she puts her husband in peril, and my husband helps me with my field work as well. And so here Magnus is collecting samples for me. He was tall enough to climb up on the rock and then collect the leaf samples for me. And so this cycad species is kind of notorious because Captain Cook, he was one of the first white Europeans to travel Australia, and he and his crew ate some of these seeds from that particular species, and they fed the seeds to the livestock, the pigs on board, and they became really sick, and they actually couldn't travel for quite some time and stayed in Cooktown, which is named after him, because they were so sick. And in fact, the seeds of cycads and the pollen and the plants themselves are quite poisonous, and the pigs that ate the seeds actually died. There's in fact a neurotoxin in cycads that is quite dangerous to humans. And in fact, Cooktown is so famous that the river in Cooktown was named after Captain Cook's ship, and so that's called the Endeavour River, and you can see that in the picture here as well. As a botanist, whenever I'm out in the field, I also try and make a side trip to any botanic gardens, and this is Cooktown Botanic Gardens. And here they had a special display of cycads, and I was thrilled to read this sign talking about cycads. And so they give the species name for this cycad, Cycas media, the Aboriginal name, and they explained that the Aborigines who lived presently now, the Aborigines know how to detoxify the neurotoxins from cycad seeds, and they actually use it as a food source rather safely. And so it involves a process of leaching out the toxins and then grinding them and cooking them in ash and then grinding them. So the other thing that I was excited to see on this sign was information about my research, my DNA research. And they also talked about Captain Cook and how he and his crew ate the seeds, and how in fact this is the oldest record of a European explorer getting poisoned by an Australian plant. And so very similar to all of our speakers tonight, my work involves a lot of driving. And so we drive in these really remote areas to look for cycads, and sometimes they're just by the road, and we're just sort of collecting cycads next to these big trucks. We spend a lot of time in and out of the car, and here's Magnus making us lunch. Here's all the field gear. You can see there's my plant press with the red straps. That's where I collect the plants and press them between sheets of newspaper for our herbarium. Of course, there's adventures, and when we were in Cooktown, we found a nail in the tyre of the car. Fortunately, we were still in Cooktown when we discovered it, and so we went to the mechanics to get it fixed. And we had to take everything out of the car so it was lighter, so we could get the tyre swapped out. And so here is my plant press full of plants from that field trip. Another hazard in Australia is the fires, of course, and one way to control the extent of fires is to do what we call controlled burns. And so some of the sites that we visit have been burnt out before, and so what happens here is the rangers will burn small sections of the bush during what we call the wet season, and so it's not dry, and so it will sort of burn out by itself. And this means that there's less tinder for when it's dry season, and so the fires basically don't take off. And so that's when we do the field work during the dry season. And in fact, during one of my field trips, I was with my student James, and we were in the middle of collecting plants. We usually collect 10 plants per population. And so one of the rangers just stopped, and I thought that they were checking on us, because usually we're in remote areas and people usually slow down if they see a car stop, just to make sure that you're okay, like you haven't broken down. And so I thought the ranger was there to see if we were okay. And in fact, what the rangers were doing was setting fire to this site. And so here you can see the fire. And so we were in the middle of this site collecting plants, and they set fire to it. And so usually I said we collect 10 plants, so we only collected samples from 6 plants, and then we got the hell out of there before the fire became any more intense. And so one of the images that I wanted to leave you with was of this particular site in the red centre of Australia. So this is in the Northern Territory. There are a couple of cycads peeking out, but this is really iconic Australia, you know, that red earth that many people associate with Australia. And as the last slide, and I wanted to leave you with, is to acknowledge the Australian Aborigines. They have a very deep, spiritual and long relationship with the Australian landscape. Here you can see some Aboriginal art. It's a snake and some dingoes, and they've collected some, I think, some lizards or goannas. And the Australian Aborigines have been in Australia for 60,000 years and have looked after the land for 60,000 years. And so I wanted to acknowledge their relationship with Australia and all of the plants and animals that we see there. So thank you. And hopefully I'll see Lynn. Oh, no, yes, there's Lynn.
Hi, right on cue. Hi, I feel like I went through a bunch of different emotions just now, going from like the leeches to then seeing a cute wombat. It was a lot of emotions. But I wanted to ask you, what is your favorite houseplant?
Oh, my favorite houseplant, and I have to confess, like just like all the other botanists, I can't grow anything. And so I have one houseplant, and it's actually this houseplant here. It's a kokedama, so it's a Japanese technique where you wrap the root in moss, and it's got string, and it's a bird's nest fern. And the thing about this is that this was done at one of the very last nightlives that we had in person at the Academy.
I do remember that.
It's kind of, I think it's kind of special in that way too, and it's special that I'm showing it tonight too.
Yeah.
And it's special that I'm alive for a year.
It looks great. Another question that you asked everyone else, how did you get into botany? I know you mentioned a few things before, but would love to hear your story. Yeah,
I think I didn't know you could be a botanist when I was growing up. I'm a city person. I didn't go out on hikes, and I came to nature through documentaries and reading magazines about science. I was really interested in the environment and was growing a garden to try and be more sustainable. And then when I went to university, I was doing science, and I decided that I wanted to be a botanist, and actually started off as a paleobotanist, and then learned about cycad, which are really ancient plants and how they're really endangered, and started to work on cycads. And so that's my passion and love right now.
Speaking of cycads, do you have any tips on how to press a cycad leaf for an herbarium?
Oh, so they are a real pain in the butt to press because the leaves are absolutely enormous. And so what we do is we get the top of the leaf, we get the middle section of the leaf, or I get the middle of the section of the leaf, and then the base of the leaf. And so you don't have to preserve the whole frond because, that can be, like, I don't know, 4 feet long. It's kind of crazy. And so you just get 3 parts and any reproductive structures, and you press those. And so then you don't have to have everything.
Cool. Another question, how and if does plant poaching affect the survival of these plants, and how does it affect your field work?
Yeah, so that is one of the major reasons why cycads are threatened, because people steal them from the wild. I have been to sites in Australia where I know there have been plants that have been collected from there before to try and find those plants again to collect them for my work, and those plants are gone. And so they've been poached for people's private collections. The situation isn't as bad in Australia as it is in South Africa, where there are huge numbers of plants being poached. Many of the plants are critically endangered. Some are extinct in the wild, and there's even populations of cycads where there are armed guards who protect those plants. Just like with the gorillas, where we have rangers who are stopping poaching of animals in the wild. We have those for cycads too.
And just time for one last question, kind of the theme of the night, but before you do field work, do you have to do almost as much research on things that can bite or hurt you, so you know how to keep yourself safe? What's the kind of research prep for that?
So I, as an Australian, I'm kind of familiar with, things that are pretty dangerous. When you do go out into the field in Australia, you have to have a snake bandage. And so if you do get bitten by a snake, what you do is you wrap that, sort of, say I got bitten here, you wrap it really, really tightly around you, and you wrap it all around the limb. And so it kind of reduces the circulation in that limb. This is probably way too much. And so it stops the venom from traveling all the way around your body. So there's special like snake bandages. And so when I do go out into the field, I make sure I have, a field kit and also, things like snake bandages, but just have an awareness of what's around. It is scary out there, but I try to stay safe.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Nathalie. Let's bring on Christina, and then we can close out the night. Hi, Christina.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nathalie. I just wanted to do a couple shout outs too, like I'm taking your role, but it's funny because your story about, leeches, Annie mentioned that she did a geology field camp in Nepal and looked down and she had 4 leeches on her ankle. And she said it looked like a massacre happened on her ankle. So it's very descriptive. But yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Nathalie. This was such a pleasure to have you again. And
thank you for having me back.
Yeah. And
we also
go ahead.
We also want to thank Tanisha, Laura, and Dory, who I believe are all still backstage right now. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. Next week, we are going to Mars, sort of. We'll take a quick look at missions of the past, present, and future, and then we also get direct access to some of the engineers that worked on the Perseverance rover and the Ingenuity helicopter. And we'll also have a rock and roll musician who helped outfit the rover with the mic that captured the first sounds of Martian wind. So if you're interested in learning more about Mars, come back next week.
And I'll just do this quick because Nathalie, we're just gonna hang out with Nathalie until we're very done. Until we're done. But yeah, thank you so much for being here, everybody, again, and sticking around for the full program. And make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel so you know when we come back, which is every Thursday at 7. So yeah, the Academy is open again. If you're local, please come visit. We miss you, and we'll let you know when nightlife is back in the building. So stay tuned in many different ways. And yeah, I think that's it. Go take care of your houseplants.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.